Welcome to Wonderland Unlocked. I'm Courtney, a certified peer support specialist, and this is Series 2, Through the Rabbit Hole, the beginning of self-discovery. I've fallen down my own rabbit hole, questioning everything along the way. Now, I'm here to support you as you explore the unknown, challenge what you believe, and uncover who you really are. Take a deep breath. The rabbit hole is waiting. Let's unlock Wonderland together. Today's episode explores one of the most powerful forces in our lives, the stories we tell ourselves. These narratives, often created in our early years or reinforced by society, can shape how we see ourselves, how we move through the world, and how we relate to others. But what happens when the stories we're telling ourselves are based on false beliefs? How do they shape the decisions we make? And most importantly, how do we break free from them and rewrite our own story? As I reflect on my own journey, I realize just how much of these stories influenced my life. For so many years, I lived within the confines of a narrative that told me I wasn't good enough, that I had to prove myself, and that I wasn't worthy of love or success. I had these false beliefs that defined who I was until I started questioning them. And that's where the real work began. Because when you begin to challenge the stories you've been living by, you unlock a whole new world of possibility. Today's episode is about those stories, the ones that shape how we view ourselves. I'm going to share personal stories from my own life, explore the science behind why we create these narratives, and offer practical tools and strategies to help you begin challenging and changing those false beliefs. Before we can challenge the stories we tell ourselves, we need to understand where they come from. The origins of our false narratives are deeply rooted in our early life experiences, cultural conditioning, and societal pressures. For most of us, these stories don't form overnight. They are often built up over years, sometimes even without us realizing it. They are shaped by a mixture of external influences, internal fears, and our attempts to make sense of the world around us. I know for me, one of the earliest false narratives I formed was the belief that I had to be perfect in order to be loved and accepted. It came from the pressures I felt growing up in a home where success was highly valued. I remember feeling this immense weight every time I didn't perform up to the expectations that were set for me, whether it was school, my parents, or even just my behavior. My parents were always well-intentioned, but they had certain standards that, in my young mind, I associated with my worth. If I didn't meet those standards, I wasn't enough. This isn't an uncommon experience. Many of us are raised in environments where external achievements, grades, and appearance, social status are emphasized, often without enough focus on self-acceptance or emotional well-being. The result? We internalize the message that our worth is tied to how well we perform or how others perceive us. But the origins of these stories don't always come from our parents or caregivers. Society also plays a huge role in shaping the narratives we adopt. Think about the messages we see in the media, what it means to be successful, beautiful, smart, or capable. We're constantly exposed to images and ideas that tell us who we should be. From advertising to movies to social media, we're taught to be loved, accepted, and valued. We need to meet certain standards that aren't always realistic or even healthy. Psychologists have long studied how early life experiences and societal influences impact our self-concept, the way we see ourselves. According to social learning theory, we learn how to behave and think based on what we observe in others. If we see people around us placing value on certain achievements or appearances, we might internalize those values as our own. Over time, these beliefs become so ingrained in our thinking that we start to believe that they are universal truths about who we are and what we need to be happy. Another factor that contributes to the development of false narratives is the experience of trauma or neglect. As a child, if you felt overlooked or invalidated, whether emotionally, physically, or psychologically, This could lead to you believing that you are somehow unworthy or defective. I too struggled with these feelings of unworthiness during my adolescence. I didn't realize it at the time, but the messages I received from my family, my peers, and society left me with deep-rooted beliefs about my inadequacy. It took years of undoing that conditioning to realize how much my past experiences had shaped the story I was telling myself about who I was. These false narratives aren't just stories we tell ourselves. They're often coping mechanisms. Our brains are wired to make sense of the chaos and uncertainty. If we're faced with an overwhelming or traumatic event, our minds try to create narratives that help us understand what happened. However, sometimes these narratives are distorted by our emotions, or they're formed in reaction to negative experiences, like rejection or failure. So we might end up telling ourselves things like, I'm not worthy of love, or I'm not good enough, or I'll never be successful, all because we've internalized those messages from our past. Now that we've established where these false narratives come from, let's talk about the impact they've had on our lives. These stories, though they may seem harmless or even invisible, can profoundly shape how we move through the world and interact with others. When we believe false narratives, we often find ourselves trapped in cycles of doubt, fear, and self-sabotage. For me, believing that I wasn't good enough or that I had to be perfect in order to be loved became a source of constant anxiety. I pushed myself to the brink, trying to meet impossible standards. At the same time, I was afraid of failing, afraid that if I didn't keep up, I'd be rejected or abandoned again. I worked myself crazy, stayed in toxic relationships, and took on more than I could handle, all in the name of proving that I was worthy of love, acceptance, and success. But none of it worked. The more I tried to prove myself, the further I got away from my true self. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, and I felt like I was failing no matter what I did. Can you relate to that? For many people, when we believe that we're not enough, we end up overcompensating in unhealthy ways. Whether it's overworking, perfectionism, or people-pleasing, these coping mechanisms are driven by the desire to make up for the gap between who we are and who we think we should be. Research in psychology shows that perfectionism is closely linked to anxiety and depression. When we strive for perfection, we're often setting ourselves up for failure because perfection is an impossible goal. A leading researcher stated that shame and vulnerability, perfectionism, is a shield that people use to protect themselves from criticism, rejection, and feelings of inadequacy. But instead of providing protection, it creates a cycle of fear, self-criticism, and burnout. What's interesting is that perfectionism often stems from the desire to control how others perceive us. When we believe that we are unworthy of love or acceptance unless we achieve certain things or appear a certain way, we can become hyper-focused on external validation. This leads to a constant need to prove to ourselves, no matter how much we accomplish, it's just never enough. This is the damaging cycle of false narratives. Let's also talk about relationships. For many of us, false narratives can affect how we form connections with others. If you believe that you're not worthy of love, you may find yourself in relationships where you tolerate poor treatment or struggle to set healthy boundaries. When I looked back at some of the relationships I had during my younger years, I saw how much I was settling for less than I deserved, all because I didn't think I was worthy of better treatment. These stories we tell ourselves become self-fulfilling prophecies. Self-sabotage is another powerful outcome of believing our false narratives. A psychologist explained that our subconscious mind is constantly working to make our beliefs come true, even when those beliefs are negative. So, when we believe that we're not good enough or that we can't succeed, we may unconsciously make choices that prevent us from achieving our goals. This is the cycle of self-sabotage. Our beliefs shape our actions, and our actions reinforce those beliefs. This is where things get tricky. Because once we believe a false narrative, our brain starts to look for evidence that supports it. It's like a filter that distorts how we see the world. If I believe that I'm not good enough, I'll tend to focus on all the times I made mistakes, ignore my successes, and even interpret neutral events as a negative light. This confirmation bias keeps us stuck in a pattern of self-criticism and self-doubt. So, why does this all matter? It matters because these false narratives, when left unchallenged, can dictate the trajectory of our lives. They influence our decisions, our relationships, and our sense of self-worth. And while these stories may have been formed, it's a way to cope with our past. They don't have to define our future. We've talked about where these false narratives come from, and we've discussed the impact they've had on our lives. Now, we've come to the critical step, recognizing the false narratives we've been telling ourselves. Without this awareness, it's almost impossible to break free from the hold that they have on us. I'll be honest with you, for a long time, I didn't even realize the false narratives I had been living by. It wasn't until I started diving deeper into my mental health journey that I began to notice how often I was telling myself stories that were not based on reality. One of the biggest aha moments I had was when I realized how much I believed that I had to be perfect to be worthy of love and acceptance. It was as if I was wearing blinders to my own worth, only seeing myself through the lens of my perceived imperfections. I had become so caught up in my own self-criticism that I didn't know how to look at myself objectively. I started to ask myself, what if I were to stop seeing myself through this lens of inadequacy? What if I allowed myself to see the whole picture, the good and the not so good, and embraced it as part of who I am? And that's when the awareness started to form. The process of recognizing false narratives is rooted in self-awareness. According to mindfulness research, the more aware we are of our thoughts and emotions, the better we can separate ourselves from them. When we practice self-awareness, we can step back and observe our thoughts without judgment, creating space for more compassionate self-reflection. If we don't know what story we're telling ourselves, we can't change it. The good news is that becoming aware of our false narratives is something that we can all practice. It takes time and patience, but the process starts by noticing when we feel triggered, when our emotions feel overwhelming, or when we're about to make decisions that don't align with who we truly are. For me, I started paying attention to the moments when I felt most anxious or insecure. One of the first things I realized was how often I used perfectionism to avoid facing uncomfortable emotions. Whenever I would feel rejected or criticized, I would immediately go into overdrive, working harder, doing more, or changing myself to gain approval. This was a telltale sign of the false narrative I had been living with, that I had to prove my worth through performance. Once I started catching these moments of overcompensation, I began to question them. Is this truly you? Am I really not enough? Or is it just a story I've been telling myself for years? And that simple shift in perspective, asking myself, is this story real? Began to change everything. Here's a simple exercise to begin recognizing your own false narratives. Start by keeping a journal. Throughout the day, write down moments when you feel triggered or when you notice negative self-talk. Write down the story you've been telling yourself in those moments. Is it a story of not being good enough? Of fear of failure? Of not being worthy of love? And then ask yourself, is this true? Try to observe your thoughts without judgment, simply acknowledging them as they arise. This simple act of noticing is the first step in gaining awareness of the false narratives that are shaping your life. Once we've gained awareness of the false narratives we've been living by, the next step is rewriting the story. This is where the real transformation happens. It's not enough to just recognize that the narrative is false. We must actively challenge it and create new, healthier stories about ourselves and our lives. I'll admit, rewriting my narrative wasn't an easy task. After years of believing I had to be perfect to be loved, it took a lot of internal work to begin the process of changing that story. I had to confront a lot of uncomfortable truths, like the fact that my self-worth wasn't tied to my achievements or the approval of others. I had to let go of the perfectionism that had governed my life for so long. But the more I rewrote my story, the more I began to realize how much freedom there was in simply being myself. Imperfect, messy, but still worthy of love and acceptance. This is where a powerful tool like cognitive behavioral therapy comes into play. CBT is based on the idea that our thoughts and feelings and behaviors are all interconnected. When we challenge and change our thoughts, we can change our feelings and behaviors too. In the context of false narratives, CBT helps us identify cognitive distortions, unrealistic and negative thought patterns, and replace them with more balanced, truthful ones. For example, instead of telling ourselves, I'm not good enough, we can reframe that thought onto something more empowering, like, I am worthy of love and acceptance, just as I am. This reframing process is one of the most effective ways to rewrite our narratives. For me, rewriting narratives meant learning how to embrace my flaws and imperfections as part of my unique story. I started to practice self-compassion, something I had never really learned to do. Instead of beating myself up for making mistakes, I began to acknowledge them as opportunities for growth. I gave myself permission to be imperfect and to make mistakes and not to have all the answers. And in doing so, I realized that I could still be loved and valued, even if I didn't meet society's unrealistic standards of perfection. A great way to begin rewriting your own story is by creating new self-affirming narrative. Take out a piece of paper and write down the negative, limiting beliefs that you've been holding on to, like I'm not good enough or I'll never be successful. And then for each belief, write a counter statement that challenges it. For example, if you've been telling yourself, I'm not good enough, rewrite that story as I am worthy of love and success, just as I am. Post these new affirmations where you can see them daily, on your mirror, your desk, or in your journal. One of the most powerful ways to rewrite your narrative is through self-compassion. When we are kind to ourselves, we start to see ourselves in a new light. Instead of criticizing ourselves for our faults, we can begin to view them as part of our human experience. A helpful mantra to repeat is, I am doing the best I can with what I know. This reminds us that we don't need to be perfect to be worthy of love, respect, and success. It's important to remember that rewriting your story is a process. It doesn't happen overnight, and there will be moments when the old narrative resurfaces. But with each new step, each new story you create, you move closer to the truth of who you really are. And that's the most freeing thing of all. Now that we've done the hard work of recognizing and rewriting our false narratives, it's time to bring this new story to life. Living your truth requires commitment, and it's about more than just thinking differently. It's about taking action to embody the narrative you've created for yourself. I remember the first time I started to live the new narrative I had created for myself. I had spent years telling myself that I was only worthy of love if I performed perfectly or met other people's expectations. But as I rewrote that story, I started to give myself permission to be more authentic. I allowed myself to make mistakes and to show vulnerability. I started setting boundaries with others and saying no when I needed to, something I had never done before. And slowly, but surely, I noticed that people began to respond differently to me. They respected my boundaries, and most importantly, I began to respect myself. Living our truth requires us to show up fully as ourselves, flaws and all. We have to stop pretending to be someone we're not, just to gain approval from others. It's about walking through life with authenticity and self-assurance, even when the world around us is telling us to be something else. And the more we embrace our true selves, the more others will see the value in us too. The psychology of authenticity is about being true to one's values, emotions, and beliefs. Research from the University of California shows that people who are authentic, those who align their actions with their true feelings, experience greater well-being, higher self-esteem, and more fulfilling relationships. In contrast, people who live out false narratives and suppress their true selves tend to experience more anxiety, depression, and emotional distress. When we live authentically, we allow ourselves the freedom to be who we are, imperfections and all, and to be open to growth and change. It's a continuous journey of self-discovery and self-acceptance, and it requires consistent effort. But with time, we come to realize that we don't need to fit into anyone else's mold. We just need to be ourselves, because who we are is enough. One of the ways I've been living more authentically is by allowing myself to be more open and vulnerable with the people I trust. For so long, I hid my true self out of fear of rejection or judgment. But when I allowed myself to be open and shared my real struggles and insecurities, I found that people were more supportive than I had imagined. In fact, being authentic, I deepened my relationships and created a deeper connection with the people who loved me for who I truly am, not the mask I had been wearing for so long. Now, here's an exercise that you can practice to help you live your truth more fully. I want you to think about a situation in your life where you've been hiding behind a mask. Maybe it's in your career, with your friends, or even in your relationship. Ask yourself, What would happen if I let go of this mask and showed up as my true self? Write down the specific ways you could be more authentic in that situation. Would you say no to a request that doesn't align with your values? Would you express your true emotions rather than pretending everything is fine? Start taking small steps towards living your truth, and over time, it will become easier and more natural to be who you are without fear of judgment. Living your truth isn't always easy, and it won't always be smooth sailing. There will always be days when the old stories try to creep back in. But each time we step into our authenticity, we strengthen our sense of self-worth and self-love. And that is where true power lies, when we no longer need to hide behind the stories we've told ourselves, but instead, embrace who we really are. As we near the end of today's episode, I want to leave you with one final thought. Your story is yours to write. No one else gets to decide who you are or what your life means. You have the power to challenge the false narratives you've been living by, and you have the ability to rewrite your story in a way that aligns with your true self. The past doesn't define you. The stories you tell yourself about your worth, your capabilities, and your potential, they can all be rewritten. I remember when I first started this journey of self-discovery, I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure of how to take that first step. But when I finally jumped, when I allowed myself to challenge the stories I had been telling myself for years, I realized that I was free. Free to be myself. Free to make mistakes. Free to create a new story. And while the process is ongoing, it's empowering to know that I get to decide who I am and where I'm going. I don't have to stay stuck in the narrative that I'm not good enough or that I have to be perfect to be loved. I am enough just as I am. I hope that by now you are starting to see the same truth about yourself. No matter what stories you've been telling yourself, you have the power to rewrite them. You are worthy of love, respect, and success. Not because of what you've achieved, but because you are inherently valuable as a human being. You are enough, and that's the most important story you can ever tell yourself. I want to thank you for taking this journey with me. Rewriting our stories takes courage, but it's the path to freedom and self-empowerment. If you've been challenged today, I encourage you to take the first step. Question your old narratives and start rewriting your truth, because the life you want is out there waiting for you to claim it. Remember, you are the author of your own story, and it's never too late to write a new chapter. Remember, you are the author of your own story, and it's never too late to write a new chapter. Thank you for listening to today's episode of Wonderland Unlocked. I hope that you can take some powerful steps toward rewriting your own story and embracing the true, authentic version of yourself. Until next time, keep unlocking the wonders within you.